Okay, good morning then. This is the cast of characters for the show today. Pisanello is not as well known as some other 15th century artists, but he's one of the first important ones by whom a lot of drawings survive. He was also the greatest metal maker of the Renaissance and had a big influence on portrait painting. Federigo da Montefeltro was called the perfect man by the Florentine philosopher Marsilio Ficino, and Federigo's court at Urbino was one of the most civilized of the whole century. On the other hand, Sigismondo Malatesta, who lived just about 20 miles away at Rimini, was regarded by Pope Pius II as the worst man who ever lived. Although, like Federigo, he was a patron of the arts, for which historians can forgive a lot of crimes. Pope Pius II himself is one of the most interesting fellows of the age and wrote a diary that is pretty much a one-of-a-kind thing in providing a real insider's view into the workings of the church administration in his day. Piero della Francesca is now regarded as one of the very greatest painters of the Renaissance, and he worked for both Federigo and Sigismondo, the perfect man and the worst man who ever lived. Leon Battista Alberti built something very nice for Sigismondo, we'll see, and Alberti was one of the most universal geniuses in an age of universal geniuses, and Andrea Mantegna was the first great painter to work in Mantua. Okay, that's the roadmap for this trip then. So, one of the most important non-Florentine artists of the 15th century in Italy was Antonio Pisanello, and this is one of his earliest surviving works. It's the St. George fresco in the Church of Santa Anastasia in Verona. Pisanello may have been born in Verona, but he went to Venice where he was a pupil of Gentile da Fabriano, who painted the Procession of the Magi we saw last time in the Uffizi Gallery. I mentioned then that Gentili's work was said to be in the International style, and Pisanello's work is put in that style also. Much of what Pisanello painted in Venice, Rome, and other places no longer survives, and this fresco in Verona isn't well preserved either, but it's obvious that it has much the same atmosphere about it as Gentili's picture. The emphasis, or so one can argue anyway, is on local detail rather than the global composition. It was painted in the late 1430s, about the terminus ad quem, the end of the period in which art historians say this style, the International style, flourished. Based on a written description of it, we'd have to put, say, Gozzoli's Procession of the Magi in the Medici Palace in Florence we saw last time in this style, but the date 1459 is pretty late for that. As I've said before, the way art historians use their terminology, the date of a work of art has at least as much to do with what style it's said to be in as what it looks like. This is, as I said, called the St. George fresco, but even Bernard Berenson, who rarely admitted to ignorance about anything, said that he didn't really know what was going on here. That would presumably be George in the center with the princess he rescued from the dragon on the right. But where's the dragon? And why are those men in the back being hanged? On either side of the princess, Pisanello has performed a tour de force of foreshortening with a horse coming and a horse going, which is impressive. But like Uccello, who was a master of geometrical perspective, he doesn't have a good grasp of how to arrange subjects in a landscape in a convincing way. Here's the princess up closer. One thing to learn from this is that sometimes you have to be really beautiful to overcome the effects of fashion. In the 15th century, women who wanted to be très à la mode removed all hair, even sometimes including eyebrows and eyelashes from their faces. Or at least, portrait painters did this for them. The hair on the scalp was also plucked far back from the face, and what was left was often concealed as much as possible. If you have perfect skin and bone structure, your looks can survive, but this kind of peeled egg look does expose any flaws. Pisanello is one of the first artists of the Renaissance, by whom we have a lot of drawings surviving, mostly in the Vallardi Codex in the Louvre. This certainly looks prima facie like a preliminary study for the horses in the St. George fresco. Most artists of the early Renaissance did not keep drawings which, if they did them at all, were usually just made as such preliminary studies for paintings and then tossed out as of no value after the work was completed. Uccello did drawings, which we have, but they are more in the nature of scientific studies than preliminary sketches for works of art, let alone things which were meant to be works of art in themselves. This is another horse by Pisanello. I think it's fair to say that no 15th century artist in Italy made drawings to be marketable works of art in their own right, despite how fine some of them are. Leonardo da Vinci, of course, made hundreds of drawings, but I don't think there's any evidence he ever tried to sell any of them. Vasari in the 16th century was one of the first to collect drawings and to treat them as we do now, as de facto works of art. I think Albrecht Dürer in the late 15th century is probably the first important artist to treat drawings and sketches as independently worthy media and to try to sell them. Pisanello's style as a draftsman or dessinateur does in fact have a lot in common with Dürer's, who was also, of course, an engraver, and I think if the technique of copperplate engraving had been known to Pisanello, he might have tried it himself. This could easily pass for a print rather than a drawing. Pisanello was a metal maker, as we'll see, and he may have touched up some of his portraits in this medium with something like an engraver's burin. Like Dürer and Andrea Mantegna, the first important Italian engraver, Pisanello draws with the point of his pencil as though he were thinking in terms of making a print. Here's another drawing by Pisanello that's very much like the sort of thing Albrecht Dürer will be doing around 1500, and there's also probably some of Leonardo da Vinci's interest in nature here. This is a hoopoe by Pisanello. Since so much of his work has been lost, it may be that some of his drawings like this were meant to be preliminary studies and we just don't have the finished works anymore. But I think most of them were done in the same spirit as that in which Leonardo did his. He was just fascinated, Pisanello, by the natural world. The hoopoe is not found in North America, but is common from the Mediterranean through the Near East, and here's one now I saw in Egypt. This is a portrait sketch which Pisanello made of Alfonso V of Aragon, who preferred to be Alfonso I, the King of Naples, and left Aragon to his brother John, the father of Ferdinand, who was to marry Isabella of Castile. A few weeks ago I mentioned that Charles d'Anjou had been invited into Italy by the Pope to drive the Hohenstaufens away, but had proven to be a cure worse than the disease. And then in 1282, the French were kicked out of Sicily following the Sicilian Vespers insurrection, and the Spanish took over there on the strength of Pedro III of Aragon's marriage to the daughter of Manfred, whom you should remember as the son of the Hohenstaufen Emperor Frederick II, who had ruled Sicily before the French invasion. Alfonso V of Aragon here was his direct descendant, and in 1435 he also occupied Naples, which the French had continued to hold. Queen Joanna II, the last real Angevin ruler of Naples, was embroiled in such a mess of intrigue at her death that the question of who really was the legitimate heir to the place was impossible to resolve except by force. Alfonso, known as the Magnanimous, did turn out, however, to be one of the more cultivated rulers of the day, though he was primarily interested in literature rather than the visual arts. This is a medallion which Pisanello made of him somewhat later in his life, and Pisanello is regarded now as the most important metal maker of the Renaissance. His metals were all cast by the lost wax process, used for sculpture rather than stamped out like coins, so they are much rarer than the mass-produced metals designed by some later artists. But there are still enough of them around that most major European museums have several. The Pope Pius II says of Alfonso here that he was indeed magnanimous and wise, except where women and horses were concerned. With regard to women and horses, says Pius, Alfonso was stark mad. Calixtus, Pius's predecessor, was a Spaniard, and the Spanish Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, the future Pope Alexander VI, cast the deciding vote for Pius, so the Spanish were very influential in Rome at this time. This is a portrait medal which Pisanello made of Leonello d'Este, the brother of Ercole and Borso d'Este of the great Ferrarese family, about whom we'll hear more eventually. Ercole married Alfonso's daughter, Leonora. Medals like this were often cast to celebrate things like birthdays, victories in battle, and so on, and were often traded around like baseball cards, especially the later mass-produced ones that had been stamped out like coins. This is a portrait of Leonello by Pisanello. The popularity of Pisanello's portrait medals, which were all done in profile, is usually said to have contributed to the fashion for painting profile portraits in the 15th century, but many of the earliest surviving Italian Renaissance portraits are done in profile simply, I think, because it's much easier to paint a subject in profile, in which format the artist doesn't have to deal as much with getting the symmetry of the features right. I think this is also connected with the fact that no 15th century Italian portrait subject has any expression to speak of on his face. It's hard to put any subtle expression, of course, into a profile, and 15th century Italians didn't like the display of emotion in works of art in any case. This is a portrait medal by Pisanello of Filippo Maria Visconti, the son of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, whom we heard about in connection with Milan a couple of weeks ago. You may remember that Gian Galeazzo was called the handsomest man in Italy, but his son here was apparently not so lucky, and was in any case known as one of the bigger cowards of his generation. It was illegal to die in his palace. If you were sick, you just had to pack up and leave. During thunderstorms, it said he hid under his bed and made servants lie on top of it to buffer any lightning bolts that might be meant for him. He married a woman who was 20 years older than he was for political reasons and never saw her, so he therefore had no legitimate children, and became the last of the Visconti to rule Milan, although various branches of the family are still around today. He did, however, have one illegitimate daughter at least, Bianca, seen here in an anonymous portrait. She married the redoubtable condottiere Francesco Sforza, who tried to use this marriage to justify his military takeover of the Duchy of Milan. She has had the honor of appearing in a magazine ad showing how modern cosmetic surgery could have benefited her. The post-operative Bianca is on the right. The catch is that in the ad, the picture on the left is identified as a portrait by Hans Holbein of Anne of Cleves, rejected a century later by Henry VIII, who said she looked like a horse. Anne may have looked no better than Bianca, but this is not she, and the picture is not by Holbein. This is Bianca Visconti. She didn't exactly marry Prince Charming either, however. This is her husband Francesco Sforza, whose nickname, Lo Sforza, or the Enforcer, became the family name. The portrait, which is still in Milan in the Brera Gallery, is by Bonifacio Bembo, who might have also painted the one of Bianca we just saw, which is also there. Francesco's father was held for ransom by a gang of extortionists and wound up taking over the gang himself, which he built into one of the most powerful mercenary armies in Italy. Francesco made it even more powerful and established himself as Duke of Milan with it, suppressing an attempt by the Milanese to establish a republic on the Florentine model to keep him out. In his diary, Pope Pius II says that Francesco did, however, have a few problems in his family. His wife, Bianca, murdered his mistress. One of his brothers betrayed him. He had to arrest one of his sons, but, says Pius, this kind of thing happens in the best of families. This is the Castello Sforzesco in Milan from the air as it looks today. During the fighting with the Republicans, the old Visconti castle here was wrecked and then rebuilt by Francesco between 1451, when he took over, and 1465 or so. It's interesting to compare this with Cosimo de' Medici's residence in Florence, built at about the same time. We saw that last week, remember. This is still a medieval fortress built into the wall of the city at the time, and a far cry from the relatively civilized elegance of the Palazzo Medici, which is right in the middle of its city. The Castello Sforzesco looks very much the part of the military fortress designed for a man living in a conquered city, which was the role it played. Francesco never left it unless accompanied by 20 bodyguards, whereas Cosimo was wont to stroll down the Via Larga to the Abbey of San Marco all by himself. While we see a little bit more of this place, we'll hear an arrangement of a song by Josquin des Prez, to whom you were just introduced last time. Eventually he was to become known as the Michelangelo of music. Here's the facade that faces the city. This is one of the corner towers. You can see the serpent that became the symbol of Milan back in Bernardo Visconti's day, as we've heard. Here's the entrance straight on. The name of the architect of the whole place isn't known, but Antonio Filarete was the designer of the central tower. He drew up plans to make Milan into a kind of ideal city, including a giant tower here honoring vice and virtue, with a brothel on the ground floor and an astronomical observatory on the top. Vasari called his writings on architecture the most ridiculous ever published, but Francesco liked him. This is the courtyard of the Castello. Leonardo da Vinci, as we'll hear in a few weeks, spent nearly 20 years here working for Francesco's son Ludovico. This is the north side of the Castello. When it was built, it was on the edge of the city, and the ducal hunting grounds stretched away to the north. Part of this area is now known as Sempione Park, and it's all surrounded by the city today. Here in the Bargello in Florence is a portrait by Francesco Laurana of Battista Sforza, who was Francesco's niece. Francesco was powerful enough that he could put relatives in control of many important places in northern Italy, and his brother Alessandro was made Lord of Pesaro, and Battista was his daughter. The first 9 children Francesco himself had were actually all daughters, and it is said that he made a vow to the Virgin to name his son Mary if she would give him one. I guess this worked because he did have a son whom he named Galeazzo Maria Sforza, but Maria is not an uncommon name for boys in Italy. His own father-in-law was Filippo Maria Visconti. Galeazzo Maria is the fellow we saw last week in The Procession of the Magi by Gozzoli, who would be assassinated in front of the Cathedral of Milan in 1476. Francesco's niece, Battista here, was just 13 when she was married to the 43-year-old Duke of Urbino, Federigo da Montefeltro, one of the most interesting and celebrated people of the 15th century. This is her portrait now in the Uffizi Gallery by Piero della Francesca, regarded today as one of the very greatest of Renaissance painters, and who, like Pisanello, spent very little time in Florence. This portrait of Battista Sforza, now Duchess of Urbino, was apparently painted in 1465 when she was still just 19, but I think she could be almost any age in this picture. Piero's modern reputation owes a good deal to the fact that Bernard Berenson championed his approach to art in the early 20th century, but some of the things Berenson says about his work hardly sound complimentary. The thing Berenson liked most about Piero, for example, is that, as he puts it, he had a heart which no emotion ever touched. Berenson did not like the representation of transient human emotion, and even went so far as to say that he didn't regret the missing heads of classical statuary, because that meant their faces couldn't display any emotion at all. Art, he thought, should be concerned rather with what is timeless and eternal. The trouble is, though, that this approach often makes Piero's portraits look like pictures of corpses with their eyes propped open. This is Piero's portrait of Bianca's famous husband, Federigo da Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, which is in the Uffizi Gallery today.
Scaramella fa la galla, cum la scarpe e la stivalla. Zomberom bombo, zomberom bombo, la zomberom borom borom, netta la zomberom borom borom bo.
Federigo here came to power in Urbino when his older brother was beaten to death by an angry mob, which was sort of the Renaissance equivalent to being voted out of office. His distinctive profile is the result of a tournament accident in which he lost part of his nose and his right eye. He became, in fact, one of the greatest condottieri of his age, and Vespasiano, who worked as a book-buying agent for him as well as for Cosimo, says of Federigo what Shakespeare says of Henry V. That, in effect, he never lifted up his hand but conquered, and he never conquered except with honor. He was not only a soldier, however, and used the profits from his military adventures to make his small town one of the centers of Renaissance civilization until well into the 16th century. Marsilio Ficino, the Florentine philosopher, called him the perfect man, and Castiglione in the Book of the Courtier called him the light of Italy. Kenneth Clark says that good manners began at Urbino, whatever that means. These two portraits are ones which may show the influence of Filippo Lippi's portrait-like Madonna in the Uffizi we saw last time. They are at least among the first with the subject in front of a landscape background, seen as though from a window in an airplane. This is the back of that portrait now, and we see Federigo riding through what I guess is supposed to be Umbria, although it looks like something on another planet, accompanied by the Virtues on sort of the 15th century equivalent to a rose parade float, I guess. One thing that made him a popular ruler was the fact that he made so much money as a mercenary he didn't have to tax his subjects. He was also very forgiving, and Vespasiano says he would consider pardoning any crime but blasphemy. Vespasiano, who was a librarian, not a soldier, credits Federigo's military success to his knowledge of Latin, a theory which does seem to betray the librarian's perspective on military science. But what he means is that Federigo studied the campaigns of antiquity and profited therefrom. Maybe, but classics departments aren't places where one usually recruits generals for armies. And Latin is no longer taught at West Point, I'm told. In any case, Federigo was a great book lover and put together one of the largest libraries anywhere in Europe, although he himself said that what he knew of warfare he learned from Francesco Sforza. This is a portrait of Federigo again by the Spaniard Pedro Berruguete. It's still in the Ducal Palace in Urbino, and I've always considered it to be the ideal picture of what comes to be thought of as the Renaissance man. Here's Federigo in his library reading, but he has his armor on. He's ready for anything. If you want to discuss Cicero, he can do that. If you want to fight a duel, he's ready for that too. Our own age is, of course, much more famous for specialization than versatility, and that's not a criticism. If I'm sick, I don't care if my doctor knows Michelangelo from Michelozzo or a howitzer from a hand grenade. 400 years ago, Francis Bacon could say, "I have taken all knowledge for my province," and be taken seriously. But 400 years ago, all knowledge was, in a very real sense, a much smaller province. That's his son Guidobaldo with him, who also grew up to be a cultivated fellow, but without his father's military and political acumen. Federigo had a manuscript illuminator named Matteo de Cantucci on his staff of 40 copyists, and this is a page he decorated in Federigo's personal copy of the Divine Comedy. The printing press had been invented by this time, but Federigo would have no printed books in his library. Vespasiano says the Duke would spare no expense or effort to get or copy the books he wanted, and his taste was omnivorous. The Greek church fathers as well as the Latin, Boccaccio as well as Dante. Most of his library wound up in the Vatican after Pope Alexander VI's son, Cesare Borgia, occupied Urbino in the days of Federigo's son Guidobaldo, and that's where his Dante here is now. Here Dante and Virgil are crossing the Styx as Filippo Argenti, who had been notorious for his bad temper, attempts to climb in their boat. During the Renaissance in Northern Europe, most of the great painters from Van Eyck to Dürer also did manuscript illumination, but few of the great Italian painters did this kind of work. Fra Angelico did a little, Botticelli left an illuminated Divine Comedy unfinished, but manuscript illumination was usually regarded as a specialty, not practiced by those who could do, as it were, real painting. The names of those who, like Matteo de Cantucci, did only manuscript illumination are not to be found in art history texts, despite their decorative skill. Here in Purgatory, the proud are forced to be humble by carrying boulders. Above is depicted the story of the Emperor Trajan, which is supposed to have been one of the things which led Pope Gregory the Great to intercede on his behalf with St. Peter and get this pagan admitted to paradise, where Dante will eventually see him. The story goes that Trajan was not too proud to stop the whole Roman army and help a poor woman. Here's Federigo's city now, Urbino as it looks today. It's a little hard from this vantage point to separate his palace from the rest of the city, but you can make out the two towers of the facade just to the left of center. And this is that facade up closer now. Kenneth Clark singles this out as the only palace in the world which does not make him feel oppressed and exhausted. And for those who felt exhausted by their visit in Federigo's day, there were 30 cooks to make them feel better, as well as iced drinks made possible by a cellar full of snow which provided cool refreshment all summer. This is the courtyard now. The architect of the palace was Luciano Lorana, who was probably related to the sculptor Francesco Laurana, who did the bust of Federigo's wife we saw earlier. They were born in the same town in the same decade anyway. Jacob Burckhardt, in his classic study of the civilization of the Renaissance, calls this the finest such courtyard in the whole period. We're going to go inside now to see more of the palace, which has some especially interesting rooms, among them the Studiolo, which is famous for its trompe-l'oeil in tarsia, its inlaid woodwork, and the Chapel of the Indulgence, or of the Pardon. By the Pope's fiat, Federigo was allowed a day off his term in purgatory every time he entered it. And while we're inside, we'll hear more of the instrumental music of Josquin des Prez. This is the so-called throne room or audience chamber. The Lion of Venice is there because of Federigo's service to that republic. This is called the Room of the Angels because of the angels over the fireplace. This is the celebrated Studiolo, all done in trompe-l'oeil and tarsia. And this is the Chapel of the Indulgence, a strange place which is only, about 10 or 12 feet high, actually. This is the door to the Room of Iole. This is one of the finest doors in Italy. And this is the fireplace in that room with Hercules on the left and Iole, one of his loves, on the right. This was Federigo's bedroom, and you can see the picture of Federigo in his library there, which we saw earlier. The palace is now the National Museum of the Marches, which does not house one of Italy's great collections, but it does have Raphael's La Muta, which we'll see later. Raphael was born in Urbino in a house just a few blocks away that still stands, and his father, Giovanni Santi, spent most of his life in the employ of Federigo and even wrote a biography of him. The museum has about a dozen of his paintings, but of course his primary contribution to the history of art was his son. This is another marble door jamb decorated with symbols of Federigo's interests. So up in the hills of Umbria here at Urbino, everything was civilized and gracious and good under the administration of the Light of Italy. But just about 20 miles away down the hill lived the man whom Pope Pius II called the worst man who ever lived, Sigismondo Malatesta, the Lord of Rimini. And this is the Rocca Sigismondo, which by reputation anyway was not a nice place at all, not filled with light and books, but dark and dank and full of bats and spiders. The Malatesta certainly did produce their share of notorious characters. There was Ramberto, who tried to kill all the other members of his family so he'd have no rivals. There was Mastino, known as the Hound, because he didn't really talk, just kind of growled and barked at people. There was Parisina, who married Niccolo d'Este when she was 14 and he was 45. She fell in love with his teenaged son and Niccolo beheaded them both. There was Gianciotto Malatesta, who killed his wife, Francesca da Rimini, and his brother Paolo when he found them together. And there was Sigismondo, the only man ever made a saint of hell, because, said Pius II, the Pope, he stood out for evil the way the saints in heaven stood out for their good. The family has provided about as much material for poets from Dante to Benedetto Croce as any family in Italy. This is a portrait of Sigismundo on a medal by Pisanello, and even Pius II admits that Sigismundo showed some promise in his youth. When he was only 12, his older brother, who was ruling Rimini, was, as it was said, seized with a fit of religious ecstasy and entered a monastery. Afraid that his relatives would deprive him of power or his life, he hired his own mercenaries and managed to keep control himself. Exactly how many of the crimes attributed to him by Pope Pius and others were really crimes he committed, it's now hard to say. He certainly has his modern defenders. This is a portrait by Pisanello of his first wife, Ginevra d'Este, the sister of Leonello d'Este, whose portrait by Pisanello we saw earlier. They were married when he was 17 and she was 16 in 1434, but she died at 22 in what were later alleged to have been mysterious circumstances, though no one seems to have thought anything amiss at the time. Within a year, Sigismundo married Polissena, an illegitimate daughter of Francesco Sforza. This was essentially a political marriage, and Sigismundo generally ignored Polissena, who entered a nunnery and was found dead of strangulation, according to the Mother Superior anyway. Sigismundo was not blamed at the time for this either, and it's hard to see what his motive might have been. He had, it's true, fallen in love with another woman who was to be his real true love, but his wife was as good as dead in a nunnery, and he didn't marry again for many years in any case. This is the girl who was to be Sigismundo's true love, Asata delle Atti, known as Asata da Rimini now, on a medal by Matteo de Pasti, who was a pupil of Pisanello. He was a versatile fellow, Matteo de Pasti, a manuscript illuminator, a sculptor, and he even superintended the work on Alberti's Malatesta Temple, which we'll see in a minute. Asata was just 14 when this medal was made in 1446. She had met Sigismundo in 1444 when she was just 12 and he was 27, but they weren't to be married until 1453. She is generally thought to have brought out the best in him. He wrote a lot of respectable poetry in her honor, like O vage dolce luce anima altra. He says, Creature gentile, o viso degno, o lume chiaro angelico e benigno in quia sola virtu mia mente spera. And she was at least part of the inspiration for the Malatesta Temple, as it's known, which the great Florentine architect and universal genius Leon Battista Alberti began working on in the late 1440s. This is the Malatesta Temple now, officially the Church of San Francesco in Rimini, the extensive rebuilding of which was undertaken by Alberti. We'll hear more about Alberti as a person and as an architect after the break, but like Brunelleschi, he was heavily influenced by Roman classicism, more however by the secular side of it than by the early Christian churches which influenced Brunelleschi. Roman triumphal arches and baths were the things that really interested Alberti, and the facade of this building certainly resembles a triumphal arch, although exactly how he was going to finish off the facade above the three arches isn't clear. Exactly why Pius II came to hate Sigismundo so much isn't altogether clear either. As we'll see, the reasons were certainly partly political, but he seems also to have especially disliked the fact that this building, nominally a Christian church, was treated by Sigismundo more as a monument to himself and his love for Asata, and also to the glories of pagan humanism, and rather less as a place of Christian worship. Sigismundo meant to have himself and Asata entombed in sarcophagi under the left and right arches, and there were to have been statues or perhaps cenotaphs of classical heroes in the colonnades along the sides. The inscription At the top reads that he dedicated it to God alone for all the help he'd received from him. But this didn't mollify the Pope, who probably just thought that presumptuous. Churches were supposed to be dedicated to saints, not to God himself. Here in the decoration of the facade, you can see several of the symbols associated with Sigismundo. The rose was the traditional symbol of the family, but Sigismundo also used the elephant as his heraldic animal of choice, and you can also see here what looks like a dollar sign, but which is thought to represent the S of Sigismundo entwined around the I standing for Esata. We're going to see some of the interior of this church now and hear the motet In Te Domini Speravi by Josquin des Prez.
In te Domini speravi.
Here's Sigismundo again, supported by his elephants. This is the tomb of Esata now. The chapel is mostly the work, probably, of Matteo de Pasti, who had more to do with the interior architecture than Alberti did. It is decorated with beautiful cherubs in relief by Agostino de Duccio. Here's one of the panels up closer. Agostino is most remembered for nearly wrecking the big block of marble which Michelangelo eventually turned into his David. Agostino wasn't the right man for a job on that scale, but these are very fine. This is more of his work. This is Agostino's Diana, who is associated with the moon in the so-called Chapel of the Zodiac in the church. In this picture you can see the sarcophagus containing what's left of Sigismundo on the inside wall of the facade rather than on the outside as originally intended. And this is thought to be a portrait, perhaps a self-portrait, of Leon Battista Alberti, although he had little to do with the way the interior of this building looks. We'll hear more about Sigismundo in a minute, but this is one of the frescoes by Pinturicchio in the Piccolomini Library in the Cathedral of Siena. Their overall subject is the life of the most famous member of that family, Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius II. Until he was about 40, Aeneas was better known for his classical scholarship, oratorical ability, and poetry than his religion. In this picture, we see him in fact being crowned Poet Laureate of the Empire by the Emperor Frederick III. In 1440, he was just 35 at the time. Of his oratorical skill, Aeneas says that he could speak for 2 hours and no one would even swallow, so rapt would his listeners be. Most lecturers are just satisfied not to have anyone snoring after that long a time. By 1440, he had acted for many years as a papal ambassador and diplomat. In 1432, he went with Cardinal Albergati to Flanders in an effort to negotiate an end to the 100 Years' War, which came to nothing, but Albergati is thought to have had his portrait painted by Jan van Eyck, and we'll see that very picture in the fall. Aeneas also visited James I of Scotland, considered one of the more cultivated Scottish kings, and remarked in his diary that the ordinary citizen in Bruges lived better than the king of Scotland. He also called the Scottish women the loosest in Europe. In 1446, however, Aeneas gave up wine, women, and song and became a priest, and I think that's when he acquired this sour expression we see in an anonymous portrait in the Vatican Museum. In 1458, he was elected pope, and his account of how this came about in his own words is very interesting to read. It sounds more like an account of how a mayor of Chicago might have been elected in the 30s than how the head of the Christian church would be chosen. I'm not going to try to sort out all the reasons for his hatred of Sigismundo, but as I mentioned, he certainly didn't like the Malatesta temple, referring to it as a temple of pagan demon worshippers. Although, despite this, he doesn't seem to have ever held anything against Alberti for designing it. He also was probably justified in his general criticism of Sigismundo's immoral lifestyle, but it was a lifestyle that could have been held against most Renaissance rulers of his day. In any case, the thing that seems to have been the immediate cause of Sigismundo's excommunication was the alliance he made with the French, who were trying to get Naples back from the family of Alfonso, the King of Naples, whose portrait medaled by Pisanello we saw earlier. The Spanish cardinal and future Pope Rodrigo Borgia had cast the deciding vote in Pius's election, and there had been considerable cooperation before that also between the papacy and the Spanish in southern Italy. Here in what doubles now as sacristy and gift shop in the Malatesta temple, we see the portrait of Sigismundo at prayer before his patron saint, Saint Sigismundo, which was painted in 1451 by Piero della Francesca. I don't know how the Pope felt specifically about this, but it doesn't look like a good idea to take your hunting dogs to church with you. It's probably a little like taking your golf clubs. It makes it seem as though you'd really rather be somewhere else. Here's Sigismundo up closer. In any case, Pius excommunicated him in 1460, charging him with just about every crime on the books. He was said to be lustful, incestuous, a drunk, an assassin, a wife murderer, fraudulent, a thief, a liar, and perjurer, avaricious, covetous, haughty, presumptuous, a disparager of ecclesiastical authority, an impudent mocker of the clergy, and a tyrant of the people. He was accused of having pursued and sometimes killed young girls and brides who resisted him, or having killed their parents who defended them. He is said to have depopulated 3 towns by his tyranny. He's said to have abandoned after betrothal the daughter of Carmagnola and of having kept the dowry. He's said to have poisoned his first wife, Ginevra d'Este. He's said to have strangled his second wife, Polissena Sforza. He's accused of killing Franciscan monks for not betraying the secret of the confession, and of offending all good Christians. At the end of the excommunication, the reading of the document, Francesco Sforza is also supposed to have commented that he knew that Sigismundo had been caught even putting ink in the holy water. So after the break, we'll hear how it turned out for Sigismundo and hear more about Piero della Francesca, Alberti, Andrea Mantegna, and others.